Hello, everyone, and welcome to our continued Bible study on the book of Acts. It is October the 7th, and we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 25 here today. So we're glad to have you with us, whether you're here with us online or in person. Before we begin, let's go ahead and start with a quick word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for the chance to hear about your word in action in history in concrete ways. And we thank you that it has come to us in concrete ways down all the way to the present here in 2020 as well, in the preaching of the word, in our baptisms, in the Lord's Supper, and in our neighbors, and so many other gifts, Lord. We pray that you would make your promises real and concrete to us, and that you would be with us today as we study. Be with Pastor Allen's family as well as they mourn the death of his father yesterday. Comfort them as only you can in the hope of your Son, the hope of the resurrection, because we know, Lord, that as you say, you are the resurrection and the life, and you give that resurrection to us. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. Before I forget, just a quick housekeeping item for this Sunday, and this will go out through other announcements and channels as well. But we've had the 8 o'clock service be the outdoor service. That is now going to be switching to 11 o'clock. And the 8 o'clock service will now be indoors. And the reason we're doing that is just as the weather gets colder, that prevents some people from attending the 8 a.m. service. And we know that people get used to their routines, and then maybe you have a preferred time you'd like to go or would like to be outdoors or indoors. But we're asking for your guys' cooperation and support in that, even though we know it's a little disruptive, because that will hopefully allow the most people possible to continue attending services as the weather changes. So just letting you all know about that. All right, so we're going to start off with the book of Acts, or the 25th chapter of Acts. And in this chapter today, we've kind of seen how in Acts chapter 24, all the way through 26:32, those chapters chronicle the Apostle Paul's time in Caesarea as he's kind of under house arrest imprisonment there. And he's giving his defenses before a series of Roman governors, before Felix and Festus and the Jewish king Agrippa II. And we're going to see how God continues to protect Paul and to advance the gospel using the unwitting rules and rulers of the civil realm. And it's kind of interesting to see how God does that despite or in spite of these rulers and their incompetence and their sinful, fallen humanity at times. God's kingdom continues to move ahead, and that's encouraging for us, because despite all of the chaos and incompetence or injustice we see, we can know that that's no obstacle to God's kingdom continuing to grow. And while Christianity is no threat to government civilly speaking, flawed secular governments continue to be contrasted kind of implicitly or indirectly in these chapters with Jesus' kingdom and reign. Because spiritually, these kingdoms are very different. Christianity isn't seeking to become God's empire on earth, right? We're not seeking to put a human in charge of whatever government we're underneath. But spiritually speaking, sometimes the kingdoms of this earth and God's kingdom come into conflict that way. So, in our first section here, we're going to see how God thwarts yet another plot against Paul in Acts chapter 25, verses 1 through 5. And if I could get somebody to read that, that would be great. Paula?
3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there.
Very good. Thank you. So, just by way of review, we see kind of the two locations here are Jerusalem down in the bottom right corner there, and Caesarea up there on the coast. And even though Jerusalem was a more influential city politically speaking, it had far more people than Caesarea there. Caesarea was kind of the governor's retreat, if you will. It was the scenic overlook by the Mediterranean, the vacation spot. And so the governors much preferred to hold court there. You've got the cool sea breeze coming in to cool things off when there wasn't air conditioning, the scenic waters, all that sort of stuff. And to this day, it's a beautiful area. But the governors are going to hold trial up there in Caesarea, and that's why there's this back and forth. But in Acts chapter 25 here, we see, or in Acts chapter 24, right before our chapter, we saw that Governor Felix, his term ended, and Governor Festus took over as governor of Judea. And these events probably occurred sometime between AD 57 to AD 59, give or take a little bit, based off of the fact that Paul spent 2 years imprisoned there at Caesarea. And Festus is attested to by the Jewish non-Christian historian Josephus, who we've talked about at different points. And Festus, as opposed to Felix, and we'll see how many times I can say those two names without getting them crossed. Festus had a better reputation for fairness and for keeping the peace in that area and for making allowances for Jewish religious practices. And Josephus talks about how Festus let some Jews appeal to Nero to put up a wall around certain parts of the temple to kind of protect their privacy and religious practices, and how Nero actually granted that request during that time. So he did a better job while he was in office of kind of keeping the Jews placated, right? And we see after his reign there is when the Jewish revolt began, and that would eventually lead to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. So part of the reason Josephus is recording these events and governors is because, one, he's a Jew himself, but also because all this stuff here in these preceding decades would lead to a pretty big kind of news event in the Roman Empire, right? That Rome had to actually send armies to go and put down this revolt in Jerusalem in AD 70. So he's giving some backstory to this, and we're the beneficiaries because we get to have some of our scriptural references cross-checked and confirmed with Josephus that way. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and just kind of a comedic note there, Brian and I were talking before class begins, and Festus certainly sounds, to me it sounds Scottish, like haggis, or, Festus would like some haggis or something like that, and just kind of a funny name there.
I think of the Addams Family.
You think of the Addams Family, right? There was, Brian referenced a pro wrestler. Yeah. So it's just kind of, yeah, the other alternative is it kind of sounds a bit like a disease, perhaps. So, but you get these kind of memorable names that help you keep track of the biblical record there, maybe. All right. So after arriving in the region, Festus, we heard, visits some different constituents in Jerusalem. Luke, in recording the book of Acts, specifically mentions how he met with the Jewish Sanhedrin or leaders there. And that's a realistic detail, actually. When you think about a new governor or somebody that comes into a political office, they're going to go meet with their most important representative constituents. And we see over and over again, Paul gives these really realistic details that are pretty true to life. And it by itself, it doesn't, definitively prove the truth of the scriptures, but all these things kind of point in that direction. You wouldn't have all these details if you were formulating an account, and these things are just littered all over the place, again, for our benefit. So it's just a neat note there. And to cut down on travel, Festus denies the Jewish religious leaders' request to bring Paul to Jerusalem. And in doing that, he unwittingly saves Paul's life because they want to organize yet another plot to try and kill Paul along the way there. And you had these roads going up or going down from Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was on a height there, that would have these canyons and rock outcroppings and gullies and things like that made for some really good ambush spots. And so no doubt they were thinking about some of those.
Appears they had a leak in the Sanhedrin, or because somebody released that information to Luke that there was going to be yet another attack.
The first time around, yes.
Well,
and
this one, 'cause it's just
yeah.
one sentence.
Oh, yeah, and this one here, yeah. So we're not quite sure about that, right? That's implied here.
Right.
And again, that's God's providence. They not only knew about it, but here they had virtually no control over it. Maybe they only found out afterwards.
That's what I'm thinking.
And here Festus is pretty pragmatic. He wants to be efficient, which is kind of how Josephus talks about him as well. And God uses that, even though God's not mentioned in this.
They were bound and determined to kill Paul.
They were. And these trials are they're very serious.
But I mean,
on a number of levels.
And you know, before he went to Caesarea, they were going to kill him on the way. And so they're very determined. Of course, the vow they took not to eat or drink, I guess I'd be determined also.
Yeah. Well, and by this point, this is quite some time later.
Yeah, I know.
With that, they were unable to keep that vow. And those sorts of vows typically were only binding insofar as it was possible for you to fulfill the vow. And so presumably, they got pretty lightheaded with hunger and stuff for a while, and then kind of went and conferred with the Sanhedrin and figured out, okay, you're released from your vow. But as we've discussed in previous weeks, though, it is pretty ironic that in their zealousness for the law, the Jewish religious leaders aim to actually violate the law.
Yeah.
And not just a minor part of it, the fifth commandment, right? Thou shalt not murder. That's significant. And that serves as a warning to us as Christians and just in general that while zeal for God's word and his house and all these things are good, to not to let ourselves get carried away in our passion to defend the faith sometimes, right? And not to, this is a classic case of where the ends certainly do not justify the means here. All right. So Festus accidentally or unwittingly saves Paul's life here again. So how can efficient and just rulers today be of benefit to Christians, even if they themselves aren't believers?
God uses them.
How does he use them?
To fulfill his wishes, to fulfill the destiny. What do you ask?
So how does my question make sense? Yeah?
I
Wayne?
think so.
Yeah.
If you know the habits and what somebody's going to do, what the Romans are going to do is always hold court down there,
Mm-hmm.
and God's going to use that, even though evil is planning to go against them. So that probably happens today, that God uses them to bring about peace, even though they may be people of war. So
Yeah. Brian, you were going to say something?
Well, I think in America we're hearing a lot about justice, social justice, but justice is actually the equal, and equality is in there too. The equal application of justice under the law.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this country that means freedom of religion. So if you have a just ruler who's equally applying that law, then we're protected as Christians to worship
Yeah, and so you look at Romans 13 and some of those passages, and we might look at that later. And rulers, even if they don't know it, really don't want to see anarchy where they're ruling, right? They don't want it to be the Wild West. And so in cases like this, or in America today, and you guys were all right, you just kind of were touching on different parts of it, that these rulers have an interest in actually seeing that the law continues to be applied equally, and that due process is followed, that laws are maintained, that justice is maintained, and all those sorts of things, so that it doesn't just become the Wild West out here. And even if a ruler is not a Christian, and even if we disagree with them about different things, some of their positions, we can be grateful for the ways that God uses them to maintain law and order. We may disagree with substantial policy positions and certain decisions that they implement, and laws and executive orders and all those things that they pass down, but we can be grateful that there even is a government, so that it's not every man for himself, and looting and pillaging and all those sorts of things. And despite all of our complaints, and they may be justified, we can be grateful we don't live in the dark ages, right? And those sorts of times. And that's a gift that God gives to us, maybe even in spite of the people that occupy the governmental offices today. God works to maintain justice and peace. And you think about law officers too, right? Policemen and all those sorts of folks. God continues to work through them, even if we disagree with the higher ups, the governors or federal officials sometimes. God is still working through all of those people that kind of trickle down into our daily lives. Emergency personnel, right? People that maintain roads and trade and electricity and all those sorts of different things. So we can certainly be grateful for that. And going back to Paul's day, Josephus notes that in between Festus and the next governor, Albinus, Jesus' brother James was killed. And that's the period when basically the Jewish high priest was able to do whatever he wanted, because there was a lengthier period without a governor. And basically the governors, even though they're kind of corrupt and a little incompetent here, were holding the Sanhedrin in check there from doing this sort of thing. And so they weren't Christians themselves, but God kind of did use the government there for his purposes and to maintain peace. And there's the threat of the sword that kept these rulers at bay. And we can be grateful for that today too. Let's actually go to Romans chapter 13 real quick. If somebody wanted to, since we're on that, if somebody wanted to read Romans 13 verses 1 through 7, that would be great.
13?
13, 1 through 7. I got it.
Okay, thank you, Wayne.
Let every person be subject to the governing authority, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to God, to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. You said through 6, through 7?
Through 7.
Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed.
Very good. Thank you. We could have an entire 10-week Bible study just on those 7 verses, which we are not going to do today. But just a couple of things to point out, and that's another one of those good passages just to be thinking about in these difficult times. I know there are a lot of questions about this sort of thing, but like these Jewish religious leaders who were held at bay while these governors were there, they were afraid of the threat of the sword, right? Because as we heard there, rulers are there to dole out justice and to kind of put the fear of God into evildoers there, even if they don't know that's why they're there. And so we continue to pay taxes, to respect the governing authorities, because we recognize, even if we don't agree with them, God is often using them in order to safeguard peace and justice. And so you may not have a lot of respect for the individual in the office, but you can still respect what God is doing through the office, if that makes sense, and the purpose for which he instituted government, even if justice is not always equally or fairly or perfectly applied there. So this should shape our prayer life in a few different ways. And just as some examples, we can pray for rulers to be just, right? We can pray for them to have a keen sense of justice, to have a good conscience about these things, to have true empathy, to be considerate and compassionate, to be efficient and impartial, to pray for God to work through them, even unwittingly sometimes, right? And we can give thanksgiving for rulers that we don't like, because even if we disagree with some of their policies, the reality is that the hammer of the law that's there does prevent things from getting worse, right? As in comparison to if there was no government at all. And we see that whenever on the news in a different country there is a revolution or a coup or something like that in some of these countries, sometimes things do get worse after that. And so we continue to pray about these things, and we try to model that in our prayers of the church too, if you listen to some of those as examples of that, and because Paul also tells us to intercede for our rulers in 1 Timothy 3. Any thoughts, comments, or questions about that? All right, well then we're going to go ahead and move along to Acts 25, verses 6 through 12. And if I could get somebody to read those verses. Sue?
After spending 8 or 10 days with them, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought down before him. When Paul came in, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. Then Paul made his defense. I have done nothing wrong against the Jewish law, or against the temple, or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges?" Paul answered, "I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, "You have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you will go."
Thank you. All right. So, just a couple of kind of fun historical notes here, but some people kind of wonder, all right, so is Luke actually there recording in the court proceedings? And he might have been, but it's possible he actually had access to the specific records of the court, because shorthand was in use by this point. The Roman legal trials were very sophisticated, and the records, we have about 250 records of papyrus, the paper at that point, that they would use to record kind of, okay, this is what this trial was about, and so on and so forth. We have about 250 of those. And the style and length both correspond pretty closely to what we see here in the book of Acts, and particularly the previous chapter, Acts chapter 24, about the same length. They'd summarize, this is kind of the argument that these guys made over here, the prosecution made, or the ones bringing the charges. And these are kind of the arguments that the defense made in response. And here's the evidence that was presented, or the lack thereof. And, this witness didn't bother to show up to this court hearing, and those sorts of things. And so we're probably getting a pretty accurate picture here of what was going on. And Luke wouldn't have wanted to write an account that was too slanted or that contradicted that too much, because if he had, then people could have just gone back and seen the court proceedings and said, well, that's not what happened at all here, right? Paul was starting fires if he was an arsonist or something. And so there was kind of a check and balance on what Luke was writing, which is interesting historically for us. So Luke goes ahead and summarizes the charges against Paul here, and those are likely similar to those made in Acts chapter 24. And I'm not going to spend too much time on these because we've reviewed them in past weeks. But they said that Paul is a disturber of the peace, that he's one who tried to be disruptive at the Jerusalem temple, and that he is seditious, and that he's possibly, it's possibly implied here that he's agitating for Jesus as king over and against the emperor. At least that's the way that the Jews kind of want to present it, as he's following this other figure that he calls a king, this Jesus. And, Governor Festus, if you're a loyal Roman citizen here, we can't have another king, can we? And never mind that, in the crucifixion accounts and the trials there, the Jews and the religious leaders respond, we have no king but Caesar, and how idolatrous that is when you think about how God is supposed to be the sole ruler over Israel. But they're happy to throw out that charge there. And Paul does maintain that Jesus is king, but Jesus doesn't need a political office in order to be king. Right? Jesus doesn't need to kick Nero out from being the emperor so that he can be a legitimate king that way. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, kind of that paradox, if you will, as we go forward. So, Paul maintains that his faith is of no threat to Rome. And my question for you guys is, before we go any further, how does our faith allow us to be the best possible citizens, like Paul is saying here, even when a ruler isn't Christian? So Paul is maintaining that his faith is of no threat to Rome. Why can Paul say that?
Well, Romans explained that we're in submission to the earthly authorities, so we have to remember what Jesus says about that. We always have Jesus as our king, but he gives us direction for how to live on earth in terms of our relationship to government.
Yes, exactly. And so as we saw in Romans 13 and Sue nicely summarized, Christians aren't worried about instituting God's kingdom on earth as a Christian nation, right? We're not worried about establishing a 21st century kingdom of God with a government constitution and charter and all those sorts of things. We're instructed just to live wherever we're at and to submit ourselves to the government, because as we heard about this last Sunday, right, the ultimate Christian hope is not in this life, it's in the life to come. And we know that, if those of us here just got together and we decided we're going to declare independence from America here in this room, right, that no matter what form of government that we came up with in our new little nation of the 10 of us or 12 of us here, that's not going to fix the problems of sin, death, and the devil, right? That's not our ultimate hope. We're not capable of fixing those things. And ultimately, God isn't worried about trying to establish a government on earth that isn't capable of fixing those things. He wants people to know the saving gospel so that they can be a part of his eternal kingdom where he will rule one day. And so we don't need to overthrow or usurp or replace governments here in this life in order to be a part of God's kingdom. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions, comments? Okay. Jeremiah 29:7 there is a good verse. And there Jeremiah says, seek the welfare of the city that you're in and pray for its people. And Jeremiah is writing that actually when the Israelites are in exile in Babylon. And so they have no hope in terms of their earthly life of ever actually gaining influence in Babylon. They're not going to be the rulers there. They're not going to have an Israelite as the head of the Babylonian nation. That's just not going to happen. But at the same time, God says, you're here. Be a good neighbor, right? Seek justice, right? Protect the peace. Promote the common welfare for your neighbor and pray for the people here. And kind of similarly, we can do that as Christians. And we do our best not to grow partisan and to appreciate the good things that our government does, even as we also sometimes have to speak out to be a voice of conscience to the government. And sometimes to say, hey, you're not treating this group over here very well. And these are our neighbors, and so we're going to speak out for them. And this is sometimes the church might say, for instance, about the unborn or about racial injustices or different things to the government. Hey, this isn't right here. And we want to officially stand up and be heard on this so that that testimony can be recorded. But we continue to support the government. We pray for them, which secular opponents can't do. Secular opponents can't pray for the government when they disagree with them. And we continue to try to follow laws, to respect government officials and emergency personnel. And when we do disagree with the government, we don't jump to revolt, right? We try to use the proper civil channels in order to reform them and to speak as a voice of conscience. Any questions on that? Okay. So, continuing with Paul's trial, he detects that despite the fact that he's innocent, and Festus even later in this chapter says, this guy's innocent. There's no charge. They haven't been able to bring any charges against him. Paul kind of detects that Festus is trying to do the Jews a favor by letting him be tried in Jerusalem there. Because again, Festus is interested in keeping the peace in that area, and he figures if I kind of offer up this sacrificial lamb here, maybe it'll keep the religious leaders in Jerusalem happy. And so Paul appeals to Caesar here. And remember, Paul is technically a Roman citizen, and Roman citizens had this privilege dating back to about 509 BC, actually, is our first record of that. And so he can appeal all the way up, basically saying this trial is that whoever is in charge of this trial is incompetent, and so I want to be tried by the emperor himself. And so that's what Paul does here. Now, what do you guys think Paul's primary motivation for appealing to Caesar here is? Is it just to save his own life, or does Paul have a bigger picture? Is there something else that he has in mind here? Paula, I think I saw your hand.
He's trying to spread the gospel all the way to Rome.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And we heard about that several times before, that Jesus, the Holy Spirit told him all the way back in Acts chapter 19, I think it was. And then also in Acts chapter 23, that Paul was going to testify before Rome to spread the gospel even there. Wayne, you had another reason?
15, Jesus said you're going to testify before kings.
Yeah, they're going to testify before kings, so that's coming true, certainly.
It's going to happen in the next verses.
Yeah, exactly. And
all the way to Rome. So Paul's eager to go before kings. I'm sure he reflects that. So he's ready to go. Send me there. And I'm sure he thinks he's going to be released because he's got plans to go to Spain and beyond. But
yeah, he's certainly hoping that he's going to be released. But yeah, Paul, quite possibly, as the trial proceedings are going on, is realizing that the muddier that this trial gets, the more he's kind of being funneled into this appeal. And it's possible Paul even realized at some point, you know what? I think God is going to send me to Rome, not being welcomed into Rome, but actually as a prisoner. You know, I think this is the way that God's going to do it, right? I'm not going to go in good standing. I'm going to go in as the lowest of the low, which is kind of how God likes to operate. That's kind of God's modus operandi in a lot of ways. You look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 18 through 31, and God's, what we would consider weakness, God can turn into strength. And the same with foolishness and wisdom and so on and so forth. Any other reasons? How would this reflect on the church? If Paul were sent back to Jerusalem, what sort of problems would that cause to the church?
Well, it might bring about its destruction, even though God can still work around it. But those who are leading the charge, who are spreading the news throughout, that's the center for the Christians in Jerusalem. And that's just maybe fire up more murders against the Christian leadership there. Don't know. But.
Exactly. Paul is always thinking about either his faith toward God or his love towards his neighbors. And I shouldn't say always, because Paul was a sinful human being like us too. But he's pretty consistent about that. He lives externally in his faith, outside of himself. He thinks about God outside of himself, and he thinks about his neighbors outside of himself. And if Paul was sent back to Jerusalem, that would kind of imply, and that the Sanhedrin was able to have their way with Paul there, that would kind of imply that Festus thought Paul was guilty of something. And that maybe these charges of sedition, of treason against Rome were true, and that maybe that was something inherent in the Christian faith. That maybe these Christians are really just a group of rebels that are trying to organize a revolt against Rome. And then the popular perception would be, well, we don't want Rome to come down on us, right? Imagine that you are a first century person living in Judea and you're not a Christian. And you learn that these Christians are trying to organize a revolt against Rome and that Rome might be bringing down the hammer soon. You don't want to have anything to do with them. You don't want to be a part of that, right? But by appealing to Caesar, Paul is able to maintain his innocence and say, I'm not trying to organize a revolt against Rome. That's not what Christianity is about. We're not trying to set up a parallel government here. And yes,
I have
Paula.
a question. How could Paul be assured that Caesar would even hear his case? Because to me, if you think about the parallels in the United States, if I say, well, I want to appeal to the Supreme Court, they're going to laugh at me. Joe Citizen in the United States can't say they want to have the ruler hear them or the highest court in the land hear them. So how can he be assured that Caesar would actually hear it?
It's because this was kind of an explicit privilege that was actually set out. And you think about, there were a lot less people in that day and age, right? The population levels were a lot lower. And not many people exercised this right. But it was laid out in the law that they could do this. and it was a regularly occurring practice. So there was precedent for this. It wasn't as if Paul was just kind of putting out this hope and a dream and a prayer sort of appeal thing. Other people had done this, and that we have historical attestation to that. That this has happened before with previous cases, and it would happen again after Paul as well. And so he did have to wait quite a while there in Rome. We see that he was there for, my memory is failing me, but Paul would end up actually living there kind of in house arrest in Rome for another 2 years, waiting to be on trial, just because the emperor is a pretty busy guy. And it took a while to get around to it. So 2 years before he even saw the emperor there. 4 years total at least between Caesarea and Rome that Paul is imprisoned there, just waiting to get this case taken care of. So we see in terms of the court cases and how long they take to resolve, not much has changed. All right.
But again, he had that privilege because he was a Roman citizen.
Yes.
Not everyone had.
Yeah, exactly. Not everyone had that, and Paul was fortunate and to have had that, and God certainly used that. So the other reason I wanted to point out, in addition to what we already mentioned, why Paul appealed to Caesar and kind of the bigger picture that he's thinking about, not just his own life, is that if he was sent back to Jerusalem to be tried by the Sanhedrin again, then it would give the impression that Paul's Christian faith was inconsistent with Israel's faith in the Old Testament. Because of course, if he gets sent back there, they're just going to declare, yep, Paul's a heretic, right? Stone him, crucify him, put him to death, whatever the verdict is. But it's going to, the public proclamation is going to be that this Christian way is just a heretical sect. And obviously it's exactly the opposite. Christianity is the natural fulfillment of the Old Testament scriptures. So Paul, I'm sure, has all this rattling around in his head, and he's thinking of the continued proclamation of the gospel, the growth of the kingdom, the church's ability to continue to proclaim the gospel and have credibility. And so he's got to consider all those factors. And that's a good lesson for us too, is that when we are put on the spot with these things, sometimes to consider is making a spectacle about this going to hurt or help the proclamation of the gospel? And you can always say, is the gospel at stake here? And if so, how? And what would be an appropriate way for me to respond, thinking firstly about how I can support the proclamation of the gospel and my neighbor's ability to hear it. All right. So we've had some contradictory evidence here. We follow King Jesus, and we've seen, Paul's no threat to Rome, but we follow a King Jesus. And so is Christianity political or apolitical? Green?
I think it's both. Because Christianity is a human, it's a human element, and therefore we're in both realms. So I think God works through Christianity, but it also has political implications, and God directs that.
Yes.
To have His will.
Yeah. And Corrine is a good Lutheran. She answered yes. Right? She said both. And that's absolutely right. You can't say yes to one and no to the other here. There's an element of truth to both of those. And the spread of the kingdom is not correlated to who's in a political office. And in that sense, Christianity is not political in a secular sense, right? Christianity is not worried. Let me say it this way. Christianity is not dependent on having Christians in political offices. And in that sense, it's not political. And so Paul doesn't need to overthrow or replace or usurp Caesar's civil authority. He doesn't need to do those things. But at the same time, Christianity is interested in telling us how to live. And it is interested in forming the city of God, right? Matthew 5, a city on a hill, right? And the word there is polis, where we get our word for political. It is interested in forming us as a particular group of people and a culture as the church. And if politics is basically just kind of our common dialogue about how we ought to do life together, well then, yeah, Christianity is interested in that part of it, right? You know, think about the Ten Commandments. And we do have a king. We have the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings. He has a kingdom. He reigns. And even a lot of the gospel terms like good news, the gospel, right? That's the word that would be brought to cities when the emperor came in having conquered. It was the proclamation of his victory. And so there's kind of this parallel language in the New Testament that Jesus isn't interested in these political things per se, but that we are citizens of another kingdom, as Paul says in Philippians 2 there. And so the classic Lutheran way of talking about this is that we are citizens of two realms, of God's civil realm, where he works through government authorities to try to maintain peace and justice, and we're also citizens of his spiritual realm, where God rules through the gospel, through grace. And the goal in the civil realm is peace and justice, and he does that through the sword, through government offices. The goal in the spiritual realm is the salvation of sinners. And so two different goals, two different means, and as Christians, we stand in both of these realms or kingdoms, sometimes they're called, at the same time. And that's what makes it so complicated. And that's what makes all this so confusing. And if your head is spinning, well, that's probably good. If you said you understood it, I'd say, okay, that's good. Now teach me, right? Because this is complicated stuff. But what's helpful about Luther's description of those two realms, the civil realm that seeks justice and peace, and the spiritual realm which seeks the salvation of sinners through the church and through God's word, is it helps us not to try to accomplish the goals of one of those realms or kingdoms in the sphere of the other. And so we don't try to manufacture a Christian government like the Roman Catholic Church did in the Middle Ages, right? Where they were talking about spiritual matters, but they also had an army to enforce those beliefs, right? And then vice versa, on the other hand, sometimes you get governments that try to outlaw religion and those sorts of things. And both of those are different ways of confusing the goals and responsibilities of those two realms, or sometimes they're called, God's two hands, because really God is working through both of those. And one day we'll see those two hands or realms or kingdoms working in unity together. There will be perfect peace, perfect justice, saved sinners on creation, redeemed and resurrected, and we'll see no tension or disagreement between those because God will rule over both. And he does rule over both. But in this fallen, broken world that's still full of sinners, that interferes with how God would like to rule. It interferes with God's design and will for creation. I know that's pretty heavy stuff. That's complicated. There are thoughts, comments, questions, smart aleck remarks on any of that? Okay. Are you guys tracking with me? You guys are kind of my barometer, because the poor people online, if you're not tracking, they don't even have the opportunity to ask a question. So All right, we'll continue on then. Those are just a couple of good passages there. The Psalm passage there is a reminder that our trust is not in horses or chariots, meaning military power or governments, but that we stand upright because of the Lord our God, and he will help us to stand firm. And then the John 18:36 passage is just Jesus replying that his kingdom is not of this world. It's a different sort of kingdom than Pilate's kingdom, right? Or Herod's kingdom, or Festus or Nero, or our modern rulers as well. So our last section, and this will be a shorter one, hopefully, is Acts 25:13 through 27. And if I could get somebody to read verses 13 through 19. Do I have a volunteer for that? Okay. And then one more volunteer to read verses 20 through 27. Wayne, thank you.
Okay. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, "There is a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over any man before he has faced his accusers and has had an opportunity to defend himself against their charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, whom Paul claimed was alive."
Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in the custody for a decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, "I would like to hear the man myself." "Tomorrow," he said, "you will hear him." So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, "King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not live any longer. But I found that he had done nothing deserving death. And as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. But I have nothing definite to write to the Lord about him. Therefore, I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him."
Thank you, guys. All right. So in this section, we see kind of ironically, Governor Festus here is put in a bind because he was not expecting Paul to appeal to Caesar. And so he can't release Paul now that the appeal to Caesar has been made. He has to go through with it, or he could get in major trouble for denying this Roman citizen his privileges there. And at the same time, he doesn't want to waste Caesar's time by sending someone who is so obviously innocent to be tried by him. Because he said repeatedly, there are basically no charges against Paul. The Jewish religious leaders can't prove anything at this point, and Festus knows it. He only wanted to send Paul to them in Jerusalem to do them a favor. And he's thinking, I'm going to, do some kind of backdoor political maneuvering here and gain a little goodwill with this other faction of my constituents here, even though he knew Paul was innocent. And now he's got to send Paul over. And as soon as Paul gets there, Caesar is going to go, well, why did you send him all the way to me? You could have figured this out. You must be totally incompetent. It's obvious this guy is innocent. And so Festus is kind of in a bind here, we see, ironically. And he doesn't, not knowing what to write to Caesar, he decides to bring in Agrippa, who is a Jew, into the proceedings to make it look more official than it actually is. And so Luke kind of, he doesn't want to say too much about all this, but there are these kind of subtle, humorous details that he weaves in there where you can imagine the Christians reading this were kind of smiling and going, oh yeah, okay, they were, Festus was in a total bind here, and he and some of these other rulers kind of got made out to look like fools in some ways because of their own behavior. Yes, Sue.
So this conversation between King Agrippa and Festus, which is, it almost sounds like a movie, a scene from a movie, you can almost see it playing out. But how would Luke get that information that that conversation had happened?
Presumably, Paul might have been present in front of Festus, because we see it's not in this current chapter here, but in Acts chapter 26, Paul makes his defense before Herod and Herod Agrippa the second, technically. So he's the let me think about that. He is the grandson of Herod the Great and the son of Herod Agrippa, who was involved in Jesus's trial. But Paul is present to give his defense before Agrippa and before Festus in chapter 26. So it's quite possible this initial conversation occurs when Herod comes in, and Paul is already there when Herod arrives, and they're just ready to go straight to the trial, if that makes sense. It's also possible, because these were official court proceedings, that was being recorded. So, good question.
Now, during those 2 years, Paul had people attending to him and was Luke there? Do we know?
Yeah, because there are we sections throughout the book of Acts, and they pick up, I'm forgetting the exact chapter, but in the teens, where they start is where they start. And so presumably from that point on, Luke was with Paul, because the we language never stops through the rest of the book of Acts. Okay. And it's quite possible, actually, that during this 4-year combined period, that this is when Luke was writing the book of Acts. Because if he's watching what's going on with Paul, he wants to record this, he's compiling information and interviewing witnesses and all these sorts of things, quite possibly, and hearing from Paul, oh yeah, on my mission trips I did this and that, and all those sorts of things to give us an account. Yeah.
What would a definition of house arrest have been?
So that's a great question. I've got to be honest, I haven't done a ton of research on what that would have looked like in the first century, but my impression is that he would have been confined to the palace there at Caesarea and those grounds, and he probably would have had a Roman guard either following him around all the time, or sometimes, depending on the security threat that they were deemed, they might have the Roman guard chained to the prisoner. And so it would kind of be like when you see preschoolers going around and they've all got the rope, right, that they're following along with, kind of like that. And so he wouldn't be confined to a room. He might have free reign of the grounds and be able to talk with people, because the implication, and we see this all the way through Acts 27, is that his Roman guards and the officials all knew he was innocent, and so he was afforded a measure more respect because of that. And even in Acts 27, when he's taking passage in the ship, we see they're willing to listen to him. They respect his opinion. They value his judgment even. good questions.
I would imagine that if he was chained to somebody for 4 years, the rotating guards, that the message is being spread to the guards and to the families and to beyond.
Absolutely.
And so Christianity through the Gentiles in a different sense is also happening through the centurions or the Roman military. And so that's pretty evident too, or one would suppose that is taking place.
And I think we have pretty good evidence of that, actually. I'm glad you brought that up, Wayne, in Philippians chapter 1. And you guys don't have to turn there. But starting in chapter 1, verse 12, he says, "I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ." And so, you know, even the royal house, some members of the royal household have heard Paul throughout his different imprisonments and his different chances to interact with his guards. And, you know, maybe they go and they tell their commander, or they go and tell the Lord or the lady that they serve, and all these different things. And so it's not as if Paul is just sitting in a room for 4 years, unable to talk with anybody, and the mission of the gospel stops, or the proclamation of the gospel stops. God is still growing the kingdom through that time, and we're only getting to see Paul's work.
Right.
There are plenty of other Christians also out there. So, excellent points. I'm going to keep us moving along just for the sake of time. But as I said, this is Herod Agrippa II, the only surviving son of Herod Agrippa, whose death is recorded in Acts chapter 12, verse 23. And Agrippa was part Jewish. He was very trusted by Rome. We know that from extra-biblical sources, and ruled over a substantial portion of territory there in Judea. And as a trusted official with Rome, he was even allowed to appoint the high priest in Jerusalem. And so you think about that, that's a pretty substantial measure of power and political influence there. So he was pretty buddy-buddy with Rome. And he would go on to side with the Romans actually in AD 70 when the temple was destroyed. In addition to that, Agrippa was accompanied by his sister Bernice, who it was rumored he had an incestuous relationship with. And that was even the talk of the court at Rome. All the way in Rome, they were talking about this. So word got around. And Bernice would go on to be the mistress to several emperors. And I bring this up because there's kind of this ongoing contrast between these sort of sordid characters and then Paul's innocence throughout all this. And Luke doesn't even have to comment on all this stuff. It would be like, you know, if I brought up to you guys Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston today, you guys probably all know that backstory there about what happened. And so when Luke brings this up, or if I brought up Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, I don't even have to say anything else. You guys all know the story there. And that's kind of what Luke, he's just giving the historical details. He doesn't have to comment, but everybody knows exactly what is going on here. And they're all going, these are the people trying this innocent man here. This world is topsy-turvy. And so that's kind of an implicit theme here. Now, Festus wants to make himself look as if he's concerned with Paul getting a fair trial when he talks with Agrippa and he's preparing his letter to the emperor. And that differs from his concern earlier in the chapter when he just wants to do a favor to the Jews, but he's trying to make himself look better. And he does rightly note that the trial is about internal religious disputes and Christ's resurrection. And it's interesting that even in his official sort of letter about this, that has become, it's agreed now, the resurrection, this man Jesus that they say rose from the dead, that's at the center of this whole thing. And it's interesting that Festus would identify that's become clear. And the concept of the resurrection was foreign to Roman religious beliefs. They did not believe in a resurrection of the dead. And yet he's able to identify that quite rightly. He also rightly concludes that the temple disturbance was only a symptom of this supposed threat to Rome, but that there's really no grounds for it. Paul was not inciting a disturbance or a rebellion or anything along those lines. And so it's interesting in what we just read that that mention of the temple disturbance has completely disappeared from the letter to the Roman emperor, because Festus and Felix before him have basically come to the conclusion this guy is innocent here. And the only reason that he is still being held prisoner is because they're trying to maneuver politically to earn goodwill with the Jewish religious leaders back in Jerusalem. Any questions on that? Okay. So Agrippa enters with great pomp and circumstance, as earthly royalty tends to do quite often. And that's true whether they're officially rulers or you think about celebrities and Michael Jackson's funeral with a gold coffin and all these different things. And influential earthly figures tend to do that quite a bit. And while outwardly impressive, this narrative hints at their superficiality and at who the real ruler of all governments and kings and peoples is, and that's Jesus. And here, I had a question, but we're a little short on time. So I said, what does Christian royalty look like, and how should that inform the ways we react to similar pomp and circumstance today? Well, obviously, Jesus is our royal figure. And you think about his trial where he was robed in purple mockingly and beaten, where he wore a crown of thorns, right? And where he was exalted to a cross. And he says to his disciples, there are hints all over the Gospels there that's where Jesus comes into his exaltation. That's where his kingdom is made manifest. That's the type of kingdom he has, and that's the type of Lord he is, a Lord and a king who dies for his subjects so that they can be forgiven and set free from sin, death, and the devil. And so even though some of these outward displays of pomp and circumstance we still see today are impressive, and they're not necessarily bad in and of themselves, right? We can enjoy a patriotic display of fireworks or all those sorts of things. That's not a problem. We should still be aware of the fact that ultimately Jesus is our ruler and our king. Yeah, Sue.
I think what's interesting about English royalty, only because that seems to be the royalty we are most familiar with. When the Queen of England when she had her coronation, it was a church service, and she was anointed with oil like David was anointed with oil, and which sends a message to the people that really her royal figure is Jesus, and she's being put in her position as an authority figure by God for the earth, but she still sees Christ as her authority figure, which is maybe different than other countries and kingdoms, but there's definitely a precedence or a chain of command.
Yeah.
And her authority is Jesus.
Yeah, Sue made an excellent point. I don't know if everyone online could hear it, but I want to repeat it because that was very well said. Is that the Queen of England, when she comes into power, has a service in the church where she is anointed with oil, and it's very clearly done under the auspices of the church, because they want people to realize that while she is going to have earthly subjects, ultimately she is subject to Christ. And she rules in his stead and to promote peace and justice for the well-being of his people. And so there are ways that our earthly rulers can have those ceremonies and they can still be done in a very positive way. And I would say that that is a fantastic example of those two realms, those two kingdoms coming together in a positive light, even in our fallen world today. So thank you for that example, Sue. And I think what the text is getting at, though, is that with some of these immoral characters, we just don't want to let ourselves be too impressed by these outward displays of power or wealth or military might. You think about, some of the communist dictators, and they like to have military parades and things like that. And it's very impressive. Patriotic displays and things like that can be impressive. But that can't be our final gauge of how we assign our allegiance in this life. We have to remember Christ's kingdom, his church, that he rules over all. And if what the rulers are doing doesn't line up with what Jesus tells us to do, then we must obey God rather than men. Good. All right. So Festus again articulates Paul's innocence, and that's the third time he says that, or that Paul is declared innocent throughout Acts. Festus is fishing for a credible charge, but there isn't one. And by pursuing Caesar's verdict, Paul's case reflects positively on the message of the gospel in the church, because Paul is able to maintain his innocence, like we talked about earlier. And that's going to go all the way up to Rome. And eventually, church tradition tells us that Paul actually would be declared innocent by Caesar this first time he went to Rome, which then basically says to the world that, yeah, there's nothing inherently contained in the message of the gospel or in the Christian faith that is opposed to Rome itself. Even though Nero, who would be the emperor that Paul would be tried in front of, would go on to persecute Christians later, at this point in time, he makes the judgment that there's nothing contained in the Christian faith that is inherently opposed to worldly governments. So in summary, unjust officials, accusations, and imprisonments are no obstacle to God advancing the proclamation of the gospel. There is freedom in knowing that Jesus is Lord and not getting caught up in Caesar's glaive and purple. To quote from a famous play there, glaive is a sword. And I'll leave you guys with this question today. If the gospel can be advanced through Paul and through all of these mistrials and these misfits in government, then where might you have an unexpected way to share the gospel today in our lives? And it might be in a relationship you don't expect, where you don't think you have great standing. It might be, in an everyday conversation at the grocery store or with the loved one, or all sorts of different places. Unfortunately, in our lives, we probably won't have to stand trial before Caesar or his equivalent, but we still have plenty of opportunities to share the gospel. And if God can grow his kingdom through Paul, then he can certainly do that through us. All right. Any final questions, thoughts, comments? Yeah, Paula?
I'm confused about who's the more powerful leader, the governor, the Roman governor, or Agrippa? Is Agrippa more of a figurehead? I'm sort of confused about that.
Yeah, so Festus, the governor, is the more powerful figure, and Agrippa is just kind of overseeing a smaller part of the territory there. But because he is Jewish and was accounted to be part of Jewish royalty, still he's afforded a measure of respect, and he's useful to Rome in keeping a lid on Jewish revolts and those sorts of things. Any other questions? All right. Well, that's all for today. Go in God's peace and God's blessings to you all. Thank you.
Thank you.